Hey everybody, I'm Ian, and this is the first of our introductory lectures. First after the introduction that sort of sets the course, explains. But this is week one. Last video would have been week 0, I guess. But week 1, and this is on the concepts of folklore, because if you're taking a course in folklore, if you're taking an introduction to folklore, it's probably good that you have some kind of definition of what exactly we mean when we're talking about folklore. Now, obviously, it is like a compound of these two words, folk and lore. That does not exactly answer everything because we use these terms loosely. Not we as folklorists, but we want to distinguish between the everyday use of this term and the way that a folklorist might use it. But the way that a folklorist might use it means sometimes with a certain amount of precision and sometimes with a certain amount of laissez-faire, because they know exactly how it is understood. So we need to sort of complicate things a little bit before we simplify things. So again, we have this compound, this folk and lore, because what do we mean by this concept of folk? Who are the folk? What are the folk? How are the folk? When are the folk? And because we often use it as a prefix, we often use it in terms of, or an adjective. It's folk song. It's folk medicine. It's, there must be more than two. Why am I blanking? But we sort of have this hanging around as this kind of strange delimiter of some description. And then we have lore, which we will often use not simply as a noun, but as a suffix. So we'll talk about photocopy lore, or we'll talk about cyber lore, or something, where the lore is not simply a descriptor, but, again, some kind of like embodied suffix of some description. So let's just sort of start with folk. Because folk is it's been around as a term for a number of years. It's a Germanic term. Folk has this connotation of this association with the people. Literally, it has to do with the people. It's the same as the Germanic Volk. It's where we get Volkswagen, the people's wagon, from. And it has a connotation of the common people. It has a connotation of... the common people have sort of two different connotations, I guess. There's the connotation of as opposed to elites, as opposed to middle classes, perhaps even, as opposed to people with a certain amount of privilege, let's just say. But where they are recognizing privilege as something that is earned as opposed to historical reality and such and such and such and such and such. Later on, we might think of folk as kind of a framework of being, and that we are sometimes more folky than anything else. But at least within that 19th century, it had this idea of them. The people who are using this term were describing a population that they did not consider themselves a part of. They might have considered themselves related to, but not necessarily a part of. So I had that connotation of those people, the common people, the everyday people. And it seems to retain that even into the 21st century. And sometimes it is meant as a positive thing. It's an authenticator. It's like, we're good folks do this. And it's like, what's the word I'm looking for? Unpretentious, unfettered, influenced by other people. The real people think this. Turn it around, we also have that negative connotation where, that's just folk. Blah, 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 blah. That is something that is away from it. And we're going to be struggling with this tension throughout. And the entire history of the discipline, the entire history of the concept is based in this. There's an interesting analog. I'm going to mispronounce things, and I'm very apologetic for this. But in the term Mian, Mandarin Chinese is a tonal language, and so I believe the verb goes up. But M-I with an accent that goes up, N. That's how it's transliterated into English. is the Chinese term that has that same kind of connotation. The word that is used for folk is the same word that is used for people, as in People's Republic of China. So it has to do with this idea of the masses, the authentic people, as opposed to the people who had formerly been in power, the people who were formerly in oppressive forms of power. So Min has that same connotation. Now, when we were understanding folklore as being like the property, as it were, of a particular people, that was one thing. And then over time, the discipline has shifted, and we recognize that this same thing is not limited to this particular population, this unlettered, this not necessarily illiterate, but where literacy is not their primary mode. People who are based in a subsistence economy, people who are based in close proximity to land, that is not the sole domain of this stuff that we call folklore. Over time, it was recognized that people, the putative us, the same kind of middle classes, and I'm going to be speaking in these two frames, as it were, because I'm sort of trying to trace a trajectory of the discipline for you, and of the way that the term is being employed, is that after a while, if it was at one point the study of what the peasants do, and they recognize, well, there's more people than just the peasants doing this. You have to think of it as a 19th century person before we think like a 20th and 21st century person, and see the evolution in our terminology and in the adaptation to more, I think, enlightened ways of thinking. So the same kind of stuff, stories, jokes, rites of passage, ways of dress, song parody, all these sorts of things that we're going to be talking about for the entire semester were not simply the domain of these particular class of people, but that we did it as well. First of all, we noticed that it was happening in the cities, that it wasn't simply the rural where it was happening. It might still be the lower classes, but it wasn't simply the rural lower classes. It was like it's happening in factories and so on. It's happening in migrant communities. Migrant not simply from overseas and coming to wherever we happen to be and sort of identifying a group that we are othering and are coming in. It's like, oh, look, they are still continuing their ways from the homeland, but also from other places within the country and doing it in migrancy. And new ones were emerging. New lore was happening among groups that weren't solely defined by their ethnic heritage. Cowboys and lumberjacks and so on, and then factory workers and the like. And then office workers are doing this as well. There's office lore, there's office jokes, there's office pranks. And then there's things like, it's not simply, the priests do it. University faculty do it. Government agencies do it. In fact, it is pervasive. It is a mode of being with each other. It is a mode of sharing with each other. So the folk were no longer, or the term folk is not really understood as those unlettered rural people, but basically a means of being in the world. It's like it has to do with face-to-face or virtual face-to-face. It has to do with the informality of culture. The informality of groups that associate and find great meaning in the things that they exchange informally, that find great sense of identity, not necessarily community, but sense of identification with these things that are actually going to be found to be esoteric, that they are particular to this group, and they are not necessarily understood by groups outside. So it's like, this is my stuff. So groups start to become defined by the lore that they share. And you're going to be encountering this as well. As you become a student at this institution, and as you become a student in this institution, perhaps in this program, you are going to have shared experiences, shared jokes, shared references that distinguish you from other people and and distinguish you. Um, I think I have the verb wrong. You don't distinguish together, but distinguish your group as distinct and sharing something in common that is not shared with people outside. Obviously, there's overlap. Obviously, you haven't disassociated yourself with all your other groups, because that's another feature of folklore that we're going to be talking about in a minute. But I'll talk about it now. It's contextual. It has to do with this particular moment. So you can talk about something like student folklore. You can talk about something like this is the shared stories, the shared mores, the shared ways of being in the world that define me as a student at this institution, or a student in general. And then I go into my family and I have a set of narratives and shared references and jokes and so on that define me as a member of that family. Moreover, that family might occasionally participate in some kind of faith tradition, and you have not simply what your faith tradition might say is something that you have to do, but like the jokes and the stories and the ways of dress and the kind of foods that you bring to social events that define you as a member of that community. And then you might, after that, you might go back to your room and get online and start participating in your fan community and all the jokes and the insider language about that. So you belong to multiple communities at any given moment, and you are aware how to actually operate within those various communities, because you have a good sense, at the very least, of what these people know, what these people think are appropriate and inappropriate ways of being in the world, and modes of behavior, shared reference points, and you can talk with them in that mode. And of course, it's not you isolated. Just imagine you and your sibling, where the same thing is happening. You might be students in the same program and so on. But when you are elsewhere, when you're at church, you are probably both completely coherent and being able to participate as members of that church, and then go back to your fan communities and do that, and then go blah, 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 blah. So you are, it's an intelligent understanding of who you are speaking to and where you can make these shared references. But it's cumulative. You don't learn these things first day. You knowledge accretes. Knowledge develops over time. And what is that knowledge? Well, that's the lore stuff, which again is a description, is a term, isn't necessarily that particularly effective, because it's kind of like the stuff. It is the stuff. I mean, you can itemize it. And I've been itemizing it already in terms of giving examples: song, story, joke, costume, vocabulary, division of calendrical time, important events, important figures, and so on. What are the shared cultural reference that this group has? But rather than think about this focus being a particular kind of people, and instead move on to thinking of it as a kind of way of being in the world. And instead of thinking about lore as a list of things, a definitive list of things that include certain things and exclude others, rather think of that as the content of that being in the world. Maybe it's better to stop thinking of the term as a simple compound and just think of it as this sort of collective. So let's go back to this 18th and 19th century understanding, just briefly. Because the idea is that at about that time, this is in Europe, at about that time, empires were shifting, nation states were consolidating. Italy didn't exist until the mid-19th century. There was the Italian language, but there was all these different, principates and so on, and all these different little groups that sort of got together and eventually in the 19th century formed Italy. Same thing with Germany. There were Germans. There was German speakers, but there are all these different duchies and so on, and they conglomerated. And things were shifting. You also had the beginning of mass warfare, and you had the beginning of real sort of empire building, and France conquering, and you had a whole bunch of different shifts. And one of the things you also had was the shift in power that was happening. You had the shift in the balance of traditional centers of power, where you had England and Germany that were developing large economic strengths, and certainly England in terms of the British Empire, massive global economic strengths, and yet in the post-Renaissance world, culture was still basically described as the French and the Italian, basically the what was a remnant from, or what evolved more naturally from the Greeks and the Romans, which were sort of still considered the height of culture. The English look around, the Germans look around, the Scandinavians look around, and they basically say, you know what? We have this stuff. We have this stuff that is on par with the Greek and the Roman stuff. It's certainly better than, in terms of blinkered nationalism, because I'm going to get to that term nationalism, but it's certainly better than all the French and the Italian stuff. You can imagine some 18th, 19th century Brit sort of discussing that kind of thing. And they consolidate, and they say, this stuff is on par with these other groups. However, we have kind of lost it. We have kind of we lost it because our education system is teaching us Italian and French, and that is the language of culture. When we have all this wonderful stuff, it's all the way of being. But and we have lost it. We, again, the middle classes, the aristocracy. But who does have it? The folk. The folk are still out in their woods, and they are still doing these sorts of things. So you had all these people who were going out and collecting these kind of ways. It's really interesting. The Brothers Grimm, actual people, if you didn't know, they started their academic career when they were grad students, and they were working for a man whose name escapes me right now, but I'll pop it on the screen. And he was interested in the idea of, is there a concept of German law? Is there an inherent German understanding of justice, value, property, what we owe to each other, what is the responsibility of the collective to the individual, what is the responsibility of the individual to the collective, and so on. How do you do retributive justice? How do you reconcile disputes, and so on? Law, systems of law. And really, sort of, as I said, systems of justice. Is there a way of being in the world is meant to sort of strike one as a universal system of harmonious relationships, including the concepts of punishment? And so, we're stuck in Latin law. We have this, but this guy, among his many students were the Brothers Grimm, and said, maybe there is some kind of natural German justice that takes place within these rural communities. So he went out. They went out, and they were collecting, and they were trying to determine this, because this was the idea, and it's the idea that still strikes at the very heart of much of what folklore studies does, and it's also problematic. And it's the idea that the natural state of being exists within the inhabitants of the land, and that they are shaped by landscapes. This concept called romantic nationalism, that a nation is in part a product of its environment, and that these sort of things like flora and fauna, the people who work the land, know this stuff. Now, what happens is that you have this very strange thing. You have this idea of nationalism, where only particular people who share this particular worldview, you turn it around, it's like, have an actual claim to this landscape. And that becomes incredibly terrible. It becomes an incredibly terrible idea when we are talking about how we understand nationalism. Because if you think about what happens in Europe, where it's like you want you have, like, well, you have German nationalism. You have what happens in terms of National Socialism and so on, the Nazi Party and things on. And I know it's the worst internet thing in the world to immediately leap to Nazis as an example, but that is actually sort of the example in extremis, but a natural example of it. It is an example that we had in Cambodia. It's an example that we had in the Cultural Revolution in China. It's an example that we have frequently had, that people who were here and who share this way of being have a better claim. Everyone else is an outsider. Those people must be either expelled or purgated. And it is an ugly idea. It's an ugly idea when it is about people who had at one point brought people in order, particularly in order to provide, supplement their own working classes, and then when it's no longer convenient, expel them. It's more complicated when we're talking about the conflict of indigenous and colonial, because you might want to flip it. It's like, well, the indigenous at least have a moral claim to the land. Now, who has this sort of sense of proprietorship becomes a very sticky question. But I digress. But this was the idea. If you're going to, happening in the 18th and 19th centuries, if you're going to sort of create national character, if you're going to understand what it is to be of this place, and not necessarily as an exclusionary tactic, but as a way of trying to use narrative to build community. Because again, when you're talking about like these little German duchies and so on, I mean, these areas weren't much bigger than like at most like the island of Cape Breton. They weren't enormous places. And so they were kind of like manageable, as it were. Yeah, he was a king. Yeah, there was all the systems of exploitation that might imply, or king, or a duke, or whoever was the whatever the title of the person in charge was. But in a way, it was kind of like on the sort of the outer limits of people knowing each other. Once you start having this nation state, it's like, okay, well, we're going to be creating this sense of what it is to be this large group through a shared participation in story, through a shared participation in narrative, as opposed to a shared participation in actual sort of specific mutual obligation and regular contact, which is how you might otherwise have it. So it's a very strange idea. So folklore was in vogue in the 18th and the 19th centuries. It wasn't even called that yet. And here's another example. It was referred to as popular antiquities for a while. And the problem with popular antiquities is that very thing, and that it's a mixture of Greek and Latin. It's like, why would we use Greek and Latin terms to describe ourselves and our processes when we have this fine Saxon compound, as William Toms described it? Folklore. Put those two together. They're both Saxon words. And that's not an accident that was the term of choice. And it's like, this isn't something weird, and this is our stuff. This is our indigenous language, and not that which was, imposed upon us through the Norman conquest. This is the kind of like aggrievement that was happening. So then you have this idea of like this. At the same, soon thereafter, you also had Charles Darwin, and you had this idea of evolution and cultural evolution, which brought with it a whole bunch of sort of ugly stuff as well, because you had the idea that folklore was kind of not simply an unblemished past, something that hadn't been corrupted by external influences and middle-class influences and foreign influences and so on, but actually sort of turn it around, and that it was in an earlier state of evolution. So it was, again, in that sort of weird, isn't it more authentic, but isn't it all backwards? So the people who are doing this are still in that kind of primitive state. And these were the terms that were still being used, like primitive and barbarian and modern and so on, or sort of savagery and barbarism and civilization were the terms that were being thrown around. And we know the laden idea of when we label a people as the level of savagery. I mean, it's even like, their stuff is very good, but they are not welcome to the table of civilized people. They are not welcome to the bigger discussions, and they are ripe for colonization, and they are ripe for, in fact, it's our moral imperative to bring them forward. That's the thinking in the 19th century. It's unfortunately often the thinking in the 20th and 21st century, but it was certainly one of those things that justified sort of great ills, to say the least. But that was sort of one of the legacies. It's not the legacy of folklore as a discipline directly, but that is the waters it was swimming in at the time. So it's difficult to extricate itself. Now, both this idea of folklore, in terms of like its romantic nationalist past, but also this cultural evolutionary thing, it didn't really allow for new stuff. It didn't allow for new lore, as it were. It couldn't really imagine that these people were creative and responsive. I mean, they could create, but if they were creating in reflection of the modern time, that was some kind of dilution or devaluation of it, like an intrusion, like an invasive species, as it were. So you couldn't account for new things. North America changed that. The study of it in North America changed that, because you started to have people you started to have new forms. And you can sort of see this with song, and that songs were being created by populations, colonizer immigrant populations, Anglo populations, that did the same thing as songs back in Europe, told of local events, local histories, local heroes, and so on, local tragedies, but they clearly did not originate in Europe, because they had local references. And so it's like, well, this is just, North American songs. It's like, well, hold on. Maybe this qualifies too, because even though it is dated to some kind of past, post 1492 or post 1621 or post whenever, it's after a certain line in the sand. So it can't be from like some distant past. It has to have been created here. But, it's still subject to variation. It's still subject to transmission. It's open in a number of different contexts. People sing this song the exact same way, in the exact same context that they sing songs of more markedly European origin. So maybe it's the same thing. Maybe it's going to force us to reevaluate how old something needs to be. And we start to think of it as that's where we start to think of it back as a process, where this lore isn't just simply this fixed body of stuff that had some kind of origins in some kind of pre-modern time. And then this is just all the tendrils of it that have remained. What is more, that the tendrils that remain, we tend to think, are brought to us through this unfortunate conduit that is the folk themselves. Like, well, unfortunately, we only have these semi-literate people to tell the stories. And so, obviously, like a game of telephone, it went through some kind of changes. And so, oh no, this isn't. So a real disdain for the very people who we were gathering this information from. And so, but once you sort of have the spark of creativity, it's like, well, if they're creating new things, maybe, when they are not creating new things, they are still doing it with creativity and intelligence and understanding of audience and understanding of context. And so a change in a song is not a matter of, again, using song as an example, a change in a song text is not a matter of doing it wrong, introducing an error. That might be deliberate. It might be an aesthetic decision that is based on an understanding of audience. Like, I'm taking this text and I'm making it new. That might involve changing it. That might also involve being rigidly conservative in how it changes. But more than anything, it's about, this is how this thing that we value because it comes from the past, nevertheless, we make it new as we bring it into the present with the expectation that hopefully it goes into the future. So now folklore doesn't become this lodge of stuff. And then the North American context again. It's when we start seeing new moments, not simply new texts, but also new contexts in which these occur. It's one thing to think about sailing song because there have always been sailors. It's another thing to think about farming songs. There's always been farmers. But when you start thinking about linesmen, people or dam builders or North American style lumberjacks, it's like this is a different kind of group, isn't it? And when you start thinking about railway workers and city line workers, and when you start thinking about all these sorts of things, like these are different occupational contexts. And nevertheless, they are creating song, they are creating story, they are creating things within it. Song is always such a great illustration of it, so I always tend to go back to song, but there's so much in addition to it. So, then, again, you have this shift where it's what I mentioned already, in that it's not simply these groups that are still working class or subsistence living. It's groups that are using among us, our contemporary spheres, city workers, factory workers, office clerks, university faculty, priests, parliamentarians, doctors, lawyers, etc. All these groups that in some aspects of their life might actually comprise the establishment that is often in direct kind of conflict with the groups that are traditionally understood as folk. And yet they are engaging in the same kind of creativity that is equally meaningful to them. And you go to a new workplace and you find out all the jokes and the lore and the so on, or you go into a new occupation and you discover all these things, and it's like, okay, you become an insider by learning the lore. And that becomes it. All of a sudden, folklore is the kind of informal aspect of culture that does not substitute, but it sort of settles upon more formal structures. And sometimes the informal might be all that there is, but it exists within formal structures as well, that binds a group together, that a group understands, that creates a sense of identity within the group. It's fluid, it's tacit, it's not this remnant or ancient remnant. It is traditional. It usually has precedent, but nevertheless creativity can take place. The creativity that takes place is usually informed by precedent nonetheless. And it's not limited to face-to-face. Because people started looking at photocopy lore, stuff told over telephone, and of course internet lore, and of course digital folklore. And digital folklore is where so much happens now, where we're no longer bound by place at all. And these communities can exist that are as rich and as full-bodied and as full amount of exchange as face-to-face communities. And with a realization that just because the folk did not necessarily invent the medium that they might be employing, they didn't invent the telephone, they didn't invent the internet, the folk use whatever they have at their disposal in order to create, in order to build community. Folklore is not dependent on a certain form of technology. Sometimes one is participating in a genre that expressly limits itself to particular forms. And that's fine. That is totally cool. And that sometimes it's like, I'm going to be doing this traditional piece of music, and I'm going to capital T traditional, and with that I'm going to be using these traditional instruments, and I'm not going to be making new songs, I'm going to be singing old songs. Totally cool. That's fine, because what you are inheriting is a set of expectations of what constitutes a certain form of performance. Totally fine. Other forms of performance do not necessarily inherit that same set of aesthetic expectations, and therefore can employ a whole bunch of other stuff. And that's fine too. Same processes, perhaps different registers, but not hierarchically different. So that's really it. As I said, it has to do with this sort of sets of expectations, and it shifts the idea that folklore is this bunch of stuff that every now and then gets brought into performance, and really it locates performance as the center of it. That I am in this place, real or virtual, but I'm in this place with you. I have a sense of what you understand and what you would like. I have a sense of wishing to play with those senses of expectation, sometimes to surprise you, sometimes to comfort you with something that is nostalgic or familiar. And I am going to bring my intelligence to your intelligence. I'm going to bring my intelligent way of understanding what is important and share it with you, and you are going to receive it in the same way. Not all performances are going to be good. Ugh, boy, bad performances happen all the time. But that is the nature of it. And it's actually sort of creation, mutual creation between performer and audience happens. I'm starting to get very esoteric. So we're going to be seeing that throughout the entire semester. So this is a little bit long, a little bit rambly. But I want you to just, the first week of a course, you should come in with expectations and have them immediately upended. So that's what this video does, hopefully. Basically, a course in folklore is not going to just give you a list of stories and songs and like, here are 10 songs, here's 20 stories, here's a way of getting dressed, here's a way of celebrating a puberty ritual, and so on. They'll use those as examples. But the idea is that we're not looking at these things as items. Folklore is not an item-oriented discipline. There are a lot of items in it because those are the things that get manifested in performances. Prior to this revolution in folklore, we were thinking of them as items. And afterwards, we're basically thinking, oh, okay, when you and I get together, we communicate. And what we communicate together and what we create together, really. Perhaps when I'm the performer, it's more on my end, but it's for you, and therefore you are part of this process. It is that item, and that's what gets manifested. But it's not just a bad replica of something else. It is a gathering together of a set of expectations that at a particular moment in time get manifested in this particular way. Yeah, we're going to have a lot of fun this semester unpacking all this. But that's that. So this is the first video. As you remember from the intro video, we're going to be back and forth. 2 videos per week. One is going to be on the general topic, on the concepts of folklore, and then a specific reading. And the reading one will sort of sit kind of independent. And then you can answer the question of the week. And so I want you to be thinking about some of these things. So the question of the week for this week is identify something that prior to this week you might not have thought was something a folklorist would study or would want to study. And I want you to give details. Answer on Moodle, and I want you to respond to 2 other people's as well. There you go. I will talk to you soon. I will see you in another video, and otherwise, be well. Bye-bye.